Let the night wrap around you. Many listen quietly here night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. Civilizations do not usually end the way we expect them to, because they rarely collapse with sound, spectacle, or any sense of narrative satisfaction, and instead they tend to fade in a manner so quiet that history itself seems unsure whether something meaningful has occurred at all, leaving behind not the drama of ruin but the soft confusion of absence, as if a familiar voice stopped speaking mid-sentence and no one noticed until much later, when the silence began to feel heavier than noise. We are uncomfortable with this kind of ending because it does not feel like history as we've been trained to recognize it, since history prefers events that can be dated, summarized, dramatized, and explained with confidence, while silence resists structure and refuses to announce itself, forcing us to sit with a far less satisfying truth that most civilizations did not fail loudly or heroically, but instead lost momentum in small, ordinary ways that felt too reasonable to record. Imagine a city not in crisis but in routine, existing in that unremarkable stretch of time where nothing memorable is supposed to happen, where doors open because they always have, floors are swept because dust accumulates daily, water is carried because thirst remains predictable, and roofs are repaired not in preparation for disaster, but simply because rain has not changed its habits. And it is in this quiet repetition, not in monuments or myths, that civilization actually lives. Civilization survives only as long as people agree, often unconsciously, to repeat the same effort tomorrow, to wake up and accept the small inconveniences of maintenance, labor, and cooperation in exchange for a life that feels workable, and for centuries this agreement holds remarkably well, until one day the balance shifts so subtly that no single moment feels like a turning point, only a gradual sense that the effort required has begun to outweigh the comfort it once provided. Nothing dramatic happens when this realization arrives, because water still flows even if it takes longer to reach. Fields still produce crops even if yields feel disappointing. Homes still stand even if repairs never seem complete. And the arithmetic of survival still functions just well enough to avoid panic, creating a strange limbo where everything technically works, while simultaneously feeling unsustainable, a condition history later calls decline. But the people living inside it likely called another exhausting year. There is a quiet irony in how modern observers search ancient ruins for signs of catastrophe, hoping to find evidence of disaster, invasion, or sudden collapse, when the more unsettling possibility is that many of these places were abandoned, not out of fear but out of fatigue, not because life became impossible, but because it became persistently inconvenient. And inconvenience, when experienced daily and without relief, is often more persuasive than crisis. People do not leave civilizations all at once, and they certainly do not do so ceremoniously, because departure usually begins with a single household moving toward better conditions, followed by another until streets grow quieter, routines loosen, and the rhythm of daily life loses its participants, without any official declaration marking the end, since from the inside nothing feels finished, only thinner, slower, and less populated than before. What archaeologists eventually encounter in these abandoned places is not chaos but order, paused mid-motion, tools left where they were last used, rooms arranged with care, storage spaces partially filled as if someone expected to return shortly, creating a deeply unsettling impression, not of panic but of interruption, as though life stepped outside briefly and never resumed its seat. We prefer stories where civilizations fight until the end because that narrative flatters our sense of importance and drama, but it ignores a more human pattern that people tend to leave when places stop making practical sense because civilizations are not sacred contracts or eternal commitments, but practical arrangements that persist only as long as daily life feels manageable. And when the cost quietly rises without spectacle, the agreement dissolves without ceremony. There is something almost gentle about this process, not because it lacks consequence, but because it requires no villains, no conquerors, no divine explanations, and no singular moment of failure, only the accumulation of small decisions made by people seeking slightly easier lives, which, taken together, are enough to empty cities, erase routines, and leave history staring at silence, unsure when exactly the story ended. This story is not interested in the kind of history that announces itself loudly, because loud history has already been told too many times, polished into timelines and simplified into causes and consequences, while the quieter kind, the kind that unfolds without witnesses or final speeches, tends to be ignored despite being far more common. And so instead of asking how civilizations collapsed, we will ask a softer question, one that feels less heroic but more honest, which is how entire ways of life slowly became less appealing to the people who lived inside them, until staying required more effort than leaving, and leaving began to feel not like failure, but like relief. We will not be counting battles, measuring empires, or tracing dramatic turning points, because those belong to a different rhythm of storytelling, one that assumes history moves in sharp angles, when in reality it often moves like erosion, gradual and almost polite, shaped by small inconveniences repeated patiently over generations, by seasons that arrive slightly off schedule, by resources that demand a little more labor each year, and by routines that once felt stable but slowly lose their justification, creating a world where nothing is technically broken, yet everything feels harder to maintain. A condition that rarely triggers panic but steadily drains enthusiasm. What follows is a journey across many places and no single location, across centuries that blur together rather than stand apart, spanning the ancient to early classical world, roughly from 3000 BCE to 500 CE, not as a strict timeline but as a shared human experience where cities rose, functioned, and quietly emptied, not because of sudden disaster or divine displeasure, but because life itself shifted just enough to make continuity feel optional. And it is in this optionality, this moment when people realize they can leave without catastrophe following them, that civilizations begin to dissolve, not with drama, but with a series of calm, reasonable decisions that history later struggles to interpret, mistaking silence for mystery, when it may simply be the sound of people choosing something easier. Chapter 1. Civilization is built on chores. The quiet work that keeps the world from falling apart. The quiet work that holds everything together. Civilization, despite the way it is remembered through monuments, myths, and carefully curated timelines, is not actually sustained by grand ideas or dramatic moments, but by an ongoing and largely invisible commitment to ordinary labor that must be repeated endlessly without applause, meaning that every stable society rests on the quiet assumption that someone will wake up tomorrow and decide it is still worth sweeping the same floor, repairing the same roof, clearing the same water channels, and counting the same grain stores, not because these actions feel meaningful in the moment, but because neglecting them would slowly unravel everything that appears solid and permanent. This daily work forms a rhythm so consistent that it becomes easy to mistake it for permanence. Yet it is in fact extremely fragile because it depends not on belief, ideology, or loyalty, but on energy and patience, both of which erode quietly over time, especially when the rewards of effort begin to feel smaller than the effort itself, turning what was once a manageable routine into a background weight that follows people through their days, not heavy enough to cause alarm, but persistent enough to drain enthusiasm without announcing its presence. History tends to overlook this kind of labor because it produces no singular moment worth recording, no victory or defeat, no clear beginning or end, only continuity. And so civilizations often appear stable right up until the point where they are not, because the exhaustion that weakens them does not arrive suddenly, but accumulates slowly through countless small decisions to endure just a little more inconvenience than the year before, until endurance itself becomes the defining feature of daily life. What makes this unsettling is not that civilization relies on such fragile foundations, but that it relies on them so successfully for so long, creating the illusion that order is self-sustaining, when in reality it survives only because enough people continue to perform tasks that feel increasingly thankless, unaware that the moment those tasks begin to feel unreasonable rather than routine, the structure they support has already begun to loosen, even if nothing visible has changed yet. When small tasks become heavy, the earliest signs that a civilization is under strain rarely resemble disaster because they emerge instead as subtle increases in effort that feel almost impolite to complain about, such as water sources that require slightly longer walks, fields that still produce crops, but with less generosity, buildings that need repairs more frequently, and administrative routines that consume more time while offering less reassurance, creating a world where everything technically functions, yet demands a little more energy than before, encouraging people to adapt quietly rather than resist openly. Humans are remarkably skilled at adapting to gradual decline, especially when conditions worsen slowly enough to preserve hope that the situation is temporary, which allows societies to persist in states of quiet strain for generations, maintaining appearances of stability while enthusiasm drains away beneath the surface as people continue to perform their chores. Not because they believe improvement is imminent, but because stopping would feel unfamiliar, and familiarity, even when exhausting, often feels safer than change. Over time, however, this adaptation transforms into fatigue, a condition that history struggles to acknowledge because it lacks spectacle, yet fatigue reshapes behavior more reliably than fear, encouraging people to conserve energy, question the value of their effort, and reassess whether the routines that once defined their community still justify the cost of maintaining them, especially when the margin for error disappears and survival begins to feel like a continuous negotiation rather than a stable state. From the outside, centuries later, this period may appear as a mysterious decline, but from within, it likely felt like an extended stretch of tolerable difficulty where nothing compelled decisive action and yet nothing felt satisfying, leaving people suspended between continuation and departure, performing the same tasks with diminishing conviction, unaware that this emotional shift, rather than any external threat, was quietly preparing the conditions for abandonment. Fatigue as a historical force. Fatigue is rarely granted the dignity of being considered a historical force, yet it may be one of the most consistent influences on human movement across time because it operates without drama or conflict, persuading people through reason rather than fear that their effort might be better spent elsewhere. And when daily life becomes dominated by maintenance rather than meaning, individuals begin to reconsider their attachment to place, asking not whether they are allowed to leave, but whether staying still makes practical sense. These decisions do not require coordination or shared ideology, which makes them especially powerful as one household chooses to relocate toward easier conditions, followed by another that notices the departure made remaining chores heavier, gradually thinning the communal labor that once made daily life manageable. And as fewer people remain to perform the same amount of work, fatigue accelerates through simple arithmetic rather than crisis, transforming endurance into exhaustion without ever raising alarms. Archaeology encounters the result of this process not as evidence of panic, but as spaces paused mid-routine where tools rest carefully rather than being abandoned in haste. Storage areas remain partially stocked, and homes suggest interruption rather than escape, all indicating that people did not flee in fear, but left deliberately, carrying their skills and habits with them, while allowing the physical structure of their civilization to remain behind. There is a quiet, almost dark humor in the way later generations search these sites for signs of catastrophe, as if exhaustion were too ordinary to explain something so large, when in reality civilizations are simply agreements to keep doing the work, and when that agreement expires without renewal, no collapse is necessary. Only the collective decision, made calmly and without announcement, that the effort required has finally exceeded the comfort it once provided. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Sudden Disappearance. When leaving looked like vanishing, from ruins it looks instant. From the modern distance of textbooks, documentaries, and aerial photographs, ancient civilizations often appear to have vanished abruptly, as if entire cities simply stopped existing between one chapter and the next, leaving behind empty streets, silent buildings, and unanswered questions that tempt us to imagine a single dramatic cause, because sudden endings are easier to understand than long, quiet transitions, and history prefers conclusions that fit neatly into timelines rather than ones that unfold gradually across ordinary years. This illusion of sudden disappearance is reinforced by archaeology itself, which compresses centuries of slow change into a single layer of soil, making abandonment look like an event rather than a process, as if people woke up one morning, looked at their city, and collectively decided to leave without explanation, when in reality what we are seeing is the end result of many small movements, spread across generations, flattened by time, into a moment that never truly existed. We are uncomfortable with gradual stories because they resist urgency, offering no single cause to blame and no precise moment to point at, which is why we instinctively search for invasions, disasters, or catastrophes, despite the fact that absence rarely requires force, and that people are far more likely to drift away from difficulty than flee from danger, especially when nothing appears broken enough to demand immediate action. From the outside, this drift is invisible until it is complete, creating the impression that life disappeared overnight, when in fact it simply thinned, year by year, household by household, until routines no longer echoed through the streets, leaving behind spaces that feel haunted not by tragedy, but by the memory of normal life quietly concluding. From the inside, everything made sense. From within these societies, there was no sense of vanishing at all, because each decision to leave was small, practical, and easily justified, grounded not in fear or desperation, but in calculation, as families weighed effort against reward and quietly concluded that life might be easier elsewhere, especially when nearby regions offered better access to water, more fertile land, or simply fewer daily frustrations, demanding constant attention. The first departures were likely unremarkable, perhaps even forgettable, involving a single household relocating closer to resources or opportunity, carrying their belongings with care rather than haste, confident they were making a sensible choice rather than participating in the end of something larger, because from their perspective, nothing was ending, only shifting location. And the idea that their movement would one day be interpreted as collapse would have seemed unnecessarily dramatic. As more families followed, not out of panic but observation, the remaining population experienced subtle changes that felt manageable at first, such as fewer hands available for shared labor or slightly heavier workloads during repairs and harvests, which only reinforced the logic of leaving, since staying now required more effort while offering fewer benefits, turning departure into a reasonable response rather than a risky leap. At no point did these choices require coordination, leadership, or consensus, because practicality spreads quietly, and when enough people arrive independently at the same conclusion, the result resembles a collective decision, even though no one ever made one, leaving history with the illusion of a sudden disappearance where there was only a series of calm, well-considered moves. Collapse is a word used by those who stayed behind. The language of collapse belongs not to the people who left, but to those who arrived later, encountering empty cities and struggling to reconcile their scale with their silence, because it is difficult to accept that something so complex could dissolve without violence, argument, or announcement. And so we apply words that imply failure, even when failure was never experienced by the people involved. For those who relocated, there was no collapse, only transition, no dramatic end to civilization, only a decision to continue life under conditions that felt more sustainable, carrying knowledge, skills, and habits into new settings, ensuring that civilization itself did not vanish, but simply changed address, leaving architecture behind while preserving ways of living. This difference in perspective explains why archaeological sites feel emotionally confusing, presenting evidence of careful departure rather than disaster, with belongings selectively taken, structures left intact, and no signs of chaos, all suggesting that people did not flee from danger, but walked away deliberately, trusting that continuity did not require permanence. There is a quiet irony in how history insists on calling this process collapse, when from the human scale it resembled something far more familiar and far less dramatic, akin to moving on when a place no longer fits. A reminder that civilizations do not always end with noise, but often with the soft sound of footsteps leaving, one family at a time, until silence settles and later generations mistake that silence for mystery. Chapter 3: Order Without People. when silence kept everything exactly where it was. The uneasy calm of empty order. What unsettles archaeologists most when they step into an abandoned ancient settlement is not destruction, because destruction at least offers explanation, but order without people, the unnerving sight of homes still standing as if they expect return, tools placed carefully rather than dropped, pathways cleared of debris, and spaces arranged according to habits that once repeated daily, creating an atmosphere that feels less like ruin and more like a pause that has lasted far longer than anyone intended. This kind of order resists the narratives we prefer, because it does not suggest violence, invasion, or panic, but instead hints at interruption, as if life stepped out briefly and simply never resumed, leaving behind the impression that nothing dramatic forced people away, and that whatever happened unfolded gently enough to preserve routine right up until the moment it stopped being practiced. From a modern perspective, this quietness feels unsettling precisely because it contradicts our expectations of historical endings, which we assume must be loud, chaotic, or at least visibly traumatic, while these places suggest something far calmer and more deliberate, a conclusion reached without urgency and executed without disorder. The silence in such spaces feels heavy, not because of tragedy, but because it implies intention, raising the uncomfortable possibility that people left not in fear or desperation, but calmly, after deciding that continuation no longer made sense. The arrangement of these empty environments reveals how deeply civilization is rooted in habit, because habits leave traces even after people depart, and when those traces remain undisturbed, they create a haunting sense of presence without occupants, as if the routines themselves lingered after their practitioners had gone. Floors remain swept, not perfectly, but adequately. Storage areas contain supplies measured rather than hoarded, and living spaces reflect daily use rather than sudden abandonment, all of which suggests that departure was not an emergency response, but the final step in a process that allowed people to leave thoughtfully and without haste. This order becomes unsettling because it removes the comfort of catastrophe as explanation, forcing us to confront a quieter possibility that civilizations do not always break under pressure, but sometimes simply disengage, choosing not to continue without feeling the need to justify that choice. Archaeology often struggles to interpret such scenes because they lack the markers of crisis that guide interpretation, leaving behind a question that feels more philosophical than historical, asking not what destroyed these places, but why no one felt compelled to keep them alive. In this way, order without people becomes more disturbing than ruin, because it implies agency, restraint, and a level of calm decision-making that history finds difficult to accept. Interrupted habits, not broken worlds. When we encounter ancient spaces frozen in a state of careful arrangement, it becomes clear that what ended was not the world itself, but the repetition of habits that sustained it, because civilizations exist only as long as routines continue to be performed, and when those routines stop, even temporarily, the structures they support lose meaning without immediately losing form. Homes remain intact because no one needed to destroy them. Tools rest where they were last used because there was time to put them down properly. And food stores appear partially used because departure was planned around sufficiency rather than scarcity, all of which suggests that people left with foresight rather than fear. This distinction matters because it shifts the narrative away from collapse toward disengagement, revealing that what archaeology observes as abandonment may have felt to those involved like completion, the end of a chapter that no longer required daily maintenance. Habits, unlike buildings, cannot survive absence, and once people stop performing them, even the most orderly spaces begin to drift into stillness, their purpose dissolving quietly, while their form remains. From this perspective, the unsettling nature of these sites lies not in what happened to them, but in how little happened at all, how smoothly life transitioned out of these spaces without leaving behind evidence of struggle or resistance. The interruption of habit leaves behind a peculiar clarity because it strips civilization of its emotional noise and exposes its mechanics, revealing how much of daily life depends not on conscious intention, but on repetition that feels natural only while it continues. When repetition stops, meaning evaporates, and rooms become shells of former use, tools lose their narrative, and spaces become difficult to read without the presence of people to animate them, creating a silence that feels deliberate rather than accidental. This silence invites projection, encouraging later observers to imagine drama where there was likely none, because we struggle to accept that endings can occur without suffering, conflict, or spectacle. Yet the evidence suggests that these civilizations did not experience their own disappearance as a dramatic event, but as a sequence of reasonable adjustments, each one small enough to feel inconsequential, yet collectively sufficient to empty entire cities. The haunting quality of these places arises from this mismatch between expectation and reality, as order remains visible, while the lives that created it have moved on, leaving behind not ruins of failure, but evidence of routines that were simply allowed to lapse. Who left without cleaning up history? The most persistent question these silent spaces provoke is not what happened here, but who decided to leave without erasing their presence, because abandonment without destruction suggests confidence, not desperation, implying that people trusted their departure would not require concealment or defense. They took what mattered, left what did not, and walked away without feeling compelled to explain themselves to the future, unaware that centuries later their restraint would be interpreted as mystery rather than practicality. From their perspective, there was no audience watching, no historians waiting, and no obligation to perform an ending, only the practical consideration of where life could continue with less effort. And once that decision was made, there was little reason to dramatize it. This absence of drama is precisely what unsettles us, because it denies the emotional cues we rely on to make sense of history, offering instead a version of events that feels incomplete simply because it lacks excess. Yet this restraint may be the most honest reflection of how human societies actually function, ending not in chaos, but in calm withdrawal, allowing structures to remain as they were while human presence relocated elsewhere. In this way, order without people becomes a mirror rather than a mystery, reflecting back our own assumptions about how civilizations ought to end and challenging the belief that significance requires spectacle. These ancient spaces remind us that history is not always shaped by force, but often by choice, and that choice, when exercised quietly and collectively, can leave behind landscapes that feel frozen rather than destroyed. The dark humor lies in how desperately we search for extraordinary explanations, when the most likely answer may be the simplest, that people left because staying no longer felt worthwhile, and they did so carefully enough to leave their world standing, even as they stepped out of it. Civilization did not disappear here. It relocated, carrying its habits, skills, and memories into new settings, leaving behind only the architecture of routines that no longer needed to be performed. What remains is not evidence of failure, but of a gentle conclusion, one that history struggles to narrate because it does not shout, and so instead, it whispers through empty rooms, asking us to consider whether silence itself might be one of the most common endings of all. Chapter 4. When the Math Still Works. Barely. Life continued, just without a safety margin. There is a long and deceptively comfortable phase in the life of many civilizations where everything appears to be functioning well enough that no one feels justified in sounding an alarm because water still reaches the city, food still appears at the right times of year, homes remain upright, and the routines that define daily life continue to repeat themselves with familiar regularity, creating a shared sense that while life may not be easy, it is at least stable, and stability, when experienced consistently, has a way of disguising fragility as endurance. From within this condition, people do not feel as though they are living on the edge of disappearance, but rather that they are navigating a slightly tighter version of normal life, one that demands more attention, more planning, and more effort than before, yet still delivers enough reward to make continuation feel reasonable, even responsible. It is precisely this reasonableness that makes the situation so dangerous, because nothing appears broken enough to justify change, and nothing feels urgent enough to provoke collective rethinking, allowing the system to persist in a state that looks healthy on the surface, while quietly losing its ability to absorb shock. Civilization, in this phase, does not feel like it is failing. It feels like it is working harder than it used to, and working harder, especially when framed as resilience, is rarely questioned. People praise endurance, admire persistence, and mistake the ability to survive strain for proof that strain is sustainable, unaware that the disappearance of safety margins often precedes collapse, not by years, but by generations. When the math still works, life becomes an exercise in precision rather than abundance, because every resource must now be measured carefully, every delay compensated for, and every inefficiency corrected before it can ripple outward into real trouble, turning daily existence into a quiet choreography of adjustments that leave little room for rest or error. Water still flows, but it must be managed more carefully than before. Crops still grow, but harvests are now calculated rather than celebrated. Repairs still happen, but always feel one season behind, as if the present is constantly catching up to the past. This does not create panic, because panic requires sudden change, and here change arrives gradually, politely, almost apologetically, asking only for a bit more labor this year than last, a bit more patience next season than before. Over time, this produces a subtle emotional shift, one that is difficult to name while living through it, where life feels increasingly narrow, constrained not by disaster but by effort, and where the future feels less like an open horizon and more like a continuation of careful management. People still plan, still hope, still invest in tomorrow, but those plans become shorter, more cautious, and more conditional, shaped by the knowledge that there is little room left for things to go wrong. Civilization remains intact, but its mood changes, growing quieter, more restrained, less willing to take risks that once felt natural, and this psychological tightening often goes unnoticed because it does not announce itself as decline, only as maturity, responsibility, or realism. This is why civilizations can exist for long periods in a state that historians later describe as precarious, while the people living inside them experience something closer to prolonged normality, because normality has a remarkable ability to stretch itself around worsening conditions as long as those conditions change slowly enough. Each generation adapts to slightly reduced margins without feeling deprived, because they compare their lives not to an idealized past, but to the recent years they remember, which also required careful management. Children grow up learning to conserve, to plan, to avoid waste, and to accept constraint as a natural feature of life rather than a sign of crisis, internalizing a version of civilization that is narrower than before, but still recognizable. In this way, scarcity does not arrive as a shock, but as a lesson, taught gradually through daily routines until it becomes invisible. The danger lies not in scarcity itself, but in the normalization of operating without backup, because once redundancy disappears, every system becomes brittle, dependent on perfect execution and favorable conditions to continue functioning. Civilization, at this stage, resembles a structure balanced precisely on its own success, stable as long as nothing changes, vulnerable the moment something does. Yet because nothing dramatic has happened yet, there is no reason to believe that something must, and so life continues, carefully, quietly, and increasingly tired. As margins shrink, discomfort begins to accumulate in ways that are difficult to articulate because each inconvenience remains individually tolerable while collectively exhausting, producing a low-level irritation that follows people through their days without ever becoming loud enough to demand attention. A walk for water is only a little longer than before, but it is taken every day. A tool breaks slightly more often, but repairs are still possible. A harvest falls short of expectations, but still feeds everyone. None of these experiences qualifies as catastrophe, and yet their repetition changes how life feels, because effort no longer produces surplus, only maintenance. The energy that once went into improving conditions is now spent preserving them, leaving little room for creativity, generosity, or ambition. Over time, this shifts the emotional center of civilization away from aspiration and toward endurance, a transformation that feels responsible rather than alarming, yet slowly drains the sense that life is building towards something better. People continue to fulfill their roles, not because they are inspired, but because they are necessary. And necessity, when unaccompanied by hope, becomes heavy. History tends to overlook this emotional dimension because it leaves no material trace. Yet it may be one of the most decisive factors in shaping human movement, quietly persuading people that effort without progress is not a virtue, but a warning. When everything is just enough, ideals struggle to survive because ideals require time, trust, and the belief that the future will reward investment, while societies living without margin must prioritize immediate stability over long-term vision. Rituals simplify, projects shrink, and communal efforts become increasingly practical rather than symbolic, reflecting a shift in values that favors efficiency over meaning. This does not feel like moral decline to those living through it. It feels like maturity, a necessary adaptation to reality. Yet it subtly alters what people expect from civilization itself. Instead of seeing it as a source of shared purpose or collective possibility, they come to see it as a system that must be maintained carefully to avoid discomfort, a machine that works as long as it is fed constant attention. In such an environment, loyalty to place becomes conditional, tied not to identity or tradition, but to the calculation of effort versus return. People begin to ask quiet questions, not about whether their civilization is worth defending, but about whether it is still worth the cost of participation. These questions are rarely spoken aloud because nothing feels wrong enough to justify dissatisfaction, yet they linger beneath the surface, shaping decisions in subtle ways that history later struggles to interpret. It is during this phase that small disruptions begin to carry outsized emotional weight, not because they are severe, but because there is no longer room to absorb them gracefully. A delayed rain introduces anxiety rather than inconvenience. An illness feels threatening rather than unfortunate. A broken tool becomes a problem that must be solved immediately rather than eventually. Life narrows around these concerns, turning daily routines into a series of calculations designed to prevent failure rather than encourage growth. People become skilled at managing risk, yet this skill comes at a cost, because constant vigilance leaves little energy for joy or exploration. Civilization continues, but it does so in a crouched posture, braced against uncertainty, moving forward cautiously while avoiding unnecessary strain. This posture may be sustainable for a time, but it is not comfortable, and discomfort, when experienced continuously, has a way of reshaping priorities. People begin to imagine alternatives not because they are desperate, but because they are tired. And tiredness, unlike fear, encourages calm, practical decision-making rather than dramatic response. It is here that the slow logic of departure begins to take shape, not as a collective plan, but as a series of individual calculations made in kitchens, fields, and workshops, where people consider whether life might be easier elsewhere. Not better in a grand sense, but lighter, less demanding, less precise. These thoughts do not feel rebellious or disloyal. They feel sensible, even responsible, especially when neighboring regions offer slightly more forgiving conditions or simply fewer demands on daily labor. When the difference between staying and leaving is measured not in survival but in effort, the argument for departure becomes difficult to dismiss. One family moves first, not because conditions have collapsed, but because they have found an opportunity that promises relief. Another notices that shared labor has become heavier, making remaining tasks more burdensome, and quietly reaches the same conclusion. In this way, departure spreads not through panic but through arithmetic, as fewer people remain to perform the same amount of work, further tightening margins and reinforcing the logic of leaving. Civilization does not fail here, it thins, losing participants gradually until continuation requires more energy than anyone is willing to give. From a distance, centuries later, this process is often described as collapse, because it is difficult to accept that something so complex could dissolve without conflict or catastrophe. Yet the evidence suggests something far less dramatic and far more human. These civilizations did not die when everything broke, but when everything worked just well enough to postpone change until enthusiasm was gone, allowing small discomforts, patiently endured, to outlast even the strongest ideals. The math never stopped working, but it stopped feeling worth solving, and that shift, subtle and unrecorded, may be one of the most common endings in human history. Civilization did not disappear in these moments. It relocated, carrying its people, skills, and habits into new settings, leaving behind systems that remained functional but unnecessary, like tools set down after a long day of use. What remains is not evidence of failure, but of a quiet decision to step away from a life that demanded constant calculation, choosing instead a future that promised, if nothing else, a little more room to breathe. Chapter 5. Climate, but quietly. When the world changed slowly enough to be ignored. Climate rarely arrives like a warning because it does not announce itself with deadlines or ultimatums, and instead it prefers a slower, more patient approach, altering conditions just enough each year to be noticed, but not enough to provoke alarm, allowing people to adjust their expectations incrementally while believing that what they are experiencing is temporary, manageable, or simply the way things are now. Seasons still come and go, rains still fall, winds still move across familiar landscapes, yet something subtle begins to shift in their timing, their intensity, or their reliability, producing a world that feels recognizable but slightly out of tune, like a song played at the wrong tempo. From within this gradual change, life does not feel endangered, only mildly inconvenient, requiring a bit more planning, a bit more labor, and a bit more patience than before. Adjustments that people are generally willing to make because adaptation feels easier than confrontation. Climate, when it moves slowly, does not feel like a force to resist, but like a condition to accommodate. And accommodation, especially when practiced over generations, has a way of becoming invisible. Children grow up learning a slightly altered version of the world, never realizing that their routines require more effort than those of their ancestors, and so the change continues without protest, reshaping societies not through shock, but through normalization. This quiet transformation is particularly effective because it preserves the appearance of continuity, allowing civilizations to tell themselves that they are enduring rather than declining, even as the environment demands more precise management each year. Rivers still flow, but their paths shift subtly. Fields still produce crops, but yields fluctuate unpredictably. Temperatures remain within familiar ranges, yet extremes arrive more often than expected, forcing people to respond with improvisation rather than confidence. None of this feels catastrophic in isolation, and because each adjustment appears reasonable, societies invest their energy in fine-tuning systems rather than questioning their sustainability. Irrigation channels are extended, storage practices refined, planting schedules revised, and labor reorganized, all in service of maintaining a way of life that still seems possible. This focus on adaptation reinforces the belief that the situation is under control, even as the cost of control rises steadily, consuming surplus and leaving less room for error. Climate change, when experienced gradually, does not announce itself as a turning point, but as a series of practical challenges that reward diligence while quietly eroding resilience. Civilization remains upright, functional, and busy, yet increasingly dependent on favorable conditions to remain so. Over time, this dependence transforms the relationship between people and their environment, shifting it from familiarity to negotiation, where survival depends not on abundance but on careful timing and precise response. A delayed rain is no longer an inconvenience but a variable that must be managed. A hotter season becomes something to endure rather than enjoy. A colder winter demands additional preparation without guaranteeing success. Life becomes more calculated, less forgiving, and subtly more anxious, as people learn that mistakes carry greater consequences than before. Yet because these consequences unfold slowly, they do not inspire dramatic change, only increased effort, encouraging societies to double down on existing systems rather than reconsider them. This persistence is often celebrated as ingenuity or resilience, yet it can also mask the reality that adaptation without recovery leads to exhaustion. Civilization, under these conditions, begins to feel like a constant response to circumstance rather than a stable platform for growth, a shift that alters not only how people live, but how they imagine the future. Plans become shorter, expectations lower, and ambition more cautious, reflecting a world where continuity is no longer assumed, but carefully earned each year through work. What makes this especially unsettling is that climate-driven change rarely produces a single moment of realization, because there is no clear line separating manageable adjustment from unsustainable strain. Instead, societies drift across this boundary without noticing, continuing to operate as if conditions will eventually stabilize, even when evidence suggests otherwise. A dry decade is followed by another, then another, each one slightly more demanding than the last, until what was once an anomaly becomes the norm. Yet because people adapt gradually, the sense of loss is diffuse, spread across generations rather than concentrated in a single event, making it difficult to articulate or address collectively. Elders remember easier years, but their memories feel anecdotal rather than authoritative. Younger generations know only the present conditions and accept them as natural. In this way, climate reshapes civilization not by erasing the past, but by redefining normal, quietly lowering the baseline of expectation until endurance replaces optimism as the dominant mode of existence. History later interprets this as decline, but from within, it feels like responsibility. The careful management of a world that has become slightly less generous than before. As environmental conditions grow more demanding, small stresses begin to compound, interacting with existing social and economic pressures to narrow the margin of safety further. Infrastructure designed for earlier climates struggles to perform under new conditions, requiring constant maintenance and modification, while resources once considered reliable become unpredictable, forcing communities to invest more labor for diminishing returns. This does not create immediate crisis, but it does change how people allocate their energy, prioritizing survival tasks over cultural or communal pursuits, gradually hollowing out the aspects of civilization that make it feel meaningful rather than merely functional. Festivals shrink, projects are postponed, and collective endeavors are evaluated primarily through the lens of efficiency, reflecting a shift toward pragmatism that feels sensible in the moment but costly over time. Climate does not destroy civilization directly. It reshapes priorities, nudging societies toward a mode of existence that is increasingly focused on maintenance rather than possibility. This shift is subtle enough to avoid resistance, yet powerful enough to redefine what people expect from their lives. In this environment, the idea of leaving begins to feel less like abandonment and more like adaptation, especially when other regions appear to offer slightly more forgiving conditions or simply fewer demands on daily labor. Migration, in these cases, is not driven by desperation, but by comparison, as people weigh the effort required to remain against the potential relief offered elsewhere. These decisions are rarely collective or dramatic. They emerge quietly within households, informed by observation rather than ideology, and executed with care rather than haste. One family relocates to land with better access to water. Another follows, and soon the shared labor that once made adaptation possible becomes thinner, increasing the burden on those who remain. Climate, by altering conditions gradually, sets this process in motion without ever forcing it, allowing departure to appear voluntary rather than necessary. Civilization does not collapse under these circumstances. It redistributes, spreading its population across landscapes in search of equilibrium rather than clinging to locations that demand constant negotiation. From a historical distance, it is tempting to frame these movements as responses to environmental disaster, yet the evidence often suggests something far quieter, a series of reasonable choices made in response to persistent strain rather than sudden catastrophe. Climate did not expel these societies. It persuaded them gently and over time that their existing arrangements were no longer optimal. The lack of drama in this process makes it difficult to narrate, yet it may represent one of the most common ways civilizations transform, not through destruction, but through diffusion. People carry their knowledge, skills, and social practices with them, leaving behind built environments that slowly lose their purpose as maintenance ceases. What remains are landscapes that feel abandoned, not because life ended there, but because life continued elsewhere. Climate, in this sense, does not erase civilization. It encourages it to move, to reconfigure itself in search of conditions that require less effort to sustain. The quiet humor in this story lies in how thoroughly we underestimate gradual change, preferring to imagine history shaped by sudden events rather than slow pressures that never announce themselves. Climate's power does not lie in its ability to overwhelm, but in its patience, its willingness to wait while societies adapt themselves into exhaustion. Civilization responds with ingenuity, resilience, and care, qualities we admire. Yet these same qualities can delay recognition that adaptation has become too costly. By the time departure feels reasonable, it also feels inevitable, leaving behind a record that confuses later observers searching for a singular cause. The world did not end here, and civilization did not fail. It adjusted, then adjusted again, until adjustment itself became the problem. In the end, climate did not demand that people leave. It simply made staying require more effort than most were willing to give, and that quiet arithmetic, repeated across generations, reshaped human history without ever raising its voice. Chapter 6. No one announces the end. The last day that no one knew was the last. There is no meeting, no council, no final gathering where a civilization collectively agrees that it is approaching its end, because endings of this kind do not feel official from the inside, and they do not arrive with the clarity required to justify announcements, resolutions, or speeches meant to be remembered, leaving daily life to continue in a familiar rhythm that feels too ordinary to interrupt. People wake up, attend to their work, settle disputes, prepare food, repair what needs repairing, and plan for tomorrow, under the quiet assumption that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to make preparation worthwhile. This assumption is not foolish. It is practical, rooted in the way human life depends on continuity rather than foresight, and it allows societies to function long after the conditions that once supported them have begun to weaken. From within a living civilization, Even one under strain, the idea of an ending feels abstract, almost inappropriate because life still demands attention, effort, and care. No one wants to be the person who declares finality while the streets are still walked and the fields are still worked, and so the notion of an ending remains unspoken, deferred indefinitely, until it passes unnoticed. Because no one announces the end, everything continues by default, carried forward by habit rather than conviction, and this continuation can stretch on for decades or even centuries without anyone recognizing it as a final phase. People keep maintaining infrastructure, enforcing rules, and participating in shared routines, not because they believe these systems will last forever, but because these actions still solve immediate problems, and immediate problems always feel more real than distant possibilities. Roads are repaired because they are broken, not because the future of the road network has been debated. Water channels are cleared because they are clogged, not because anyone believes the system will endure unchanged. This focus on the present creates a long, suspended moment in which societies move forward without a clear sense of direction, guided by inertia rather than intention. Civilization, in this state, does not feel like it is ending. It feels like it is persisting under slightly more difficult conditions. And persistence, especially when framed as responsibility, has a way of masking decline by keeping everyone occupied. The absence of an official ending also means there is no clear last day, no final sunrise that feels different enough to be remembered as such by the people living through it. The last market day looks like every other market day, with familiar faces and familiar transactions, and no one pauses to mark the occasion because there is nothing to distinguish it from the countless days before. The final repair is made with the same care as previous repairs. The last gathering passes without ceremony, and the final harvest is stored without fanfare, because nothing about these moments announces itself as extraordinary. Even the people who leave do not believe they are participating in the end of a civilization. They believe they are making reasonable choices in response to changing conditions, relocating their lives to places where effort feels more proportionate to reward. Those who remain continue as long as continuation feels possible, and when they eventually stop, they do so quietly, not in protest or despair, but in resignation or redirection. History struggles with this kind of ending because it offers no punctuation, no event to summarize, and no date to underline, leaving behind only a gradual thinning of activity that is difficult to narrate. This is why historical records so often fail to capture the precise moment when a society ceased to function as it once did, because records themselves depend on institutions, and institutions are among the first things to weaken when continuity becomes uncertain. Writing slows, documentation becomes sporadic, and administrative habits loosen not as a deliberate choice, but as a consequence of shifting priorities. When survival and adaptation demand more attention, record-keeping feels less urgent, leaving gaps that later historians interpret as mystery rather than fatigue. The silence in the record does not signal sudden disappearance, but gradual disengagement, as fewer people see value in maintaining systems that no longer feel proportional to the effort required. Over time, the absence of documentation compounds the illusion of abrupt collapse, because what is missing is not only the people, but the explanation for their departure. The end, from this perspective, is not a moment, but a fading signal, one that grows weaker until it disappears entirely, leaving behind a civilization that seems to have vanished without warning, simply because no one was present to witness its final form. For the people living through these transitions, life did not feel like a story approaching its conclusion, but like a sequence of adjustments made in response to practical concerns. They experienced change not as a dramatic arc, but as a series of small decisions, each one reasonable on its own, yet collectively transformative. A family chooses to move closer to better land, another follows. Shared labor becomes heavier for those who remain, and routines that once felt natural begin to feel strained. None of this feels final while it is happening, because finality is a concept that requires distance. The idea that one might be living through the last generation of a particular way of life feels implausible, even melodramatic, because daily responsibilities leave little room for abstract reflection. People are too busy living to notice that the context of their lives is shifting beneath them, and so the end passes not with resistance, but with distraction. It is only centuries later, when archaeologists and historians encounter empty cities, abandoned roads, and unfinished infrastructure, that the end becomes visible, reconstructed from fragments rather than memories. From this distance, the absence of a clear conclusion feels unsettling, prompting questions about what went wrong and when, yet these questions assume that endings must be recognizable to those who experience them. In reality, the people living through these changes rarely had reason to believe they were approaching something final, because their frame of reference remained anchored in continuity rather than termination. They planned for next season, next year, and perhaps the next generation, unaware that these plans would not be fulfilled in the same place. The recognition of an ending requires hindsight, and hindsight belongs exclusively to those who arrive after everything has stopped. There is a quiet irony in how we search the past for definitive endings, hoping to find clarity where none existed, as if civilizations should behave like stories with intentional conclusions rather than like living systems that taper off when conditions no longer support them. We want a final act because it offers resolution, yet the reality is that many societies conclude not with a climax, but with a gradual withdrawal of participation until continuation simply stops happening. No one decides to end civilization. People decide to stop doing certain things, and when enough of those things go undone, the structure dissolves without resistance. This process feels unsatisfying to modern sensibilities because it denies us the drama of failure or the heroism of survival, offering instead a quiet retreat that leaves behind only traces of what once required constant effort to sustain. The end of a civilization, then, is rarely aligned with the moment we later identify as its conclusion, because it is not experienced as an ending by those who live through it. It is experienced as a long series of ordinary days that gradually lose their collective weight. As fewer people participate, fewer systems are maintained, and fewer reasons remain to continue as before. Life goes on, just elsewhere, carried forward by people who adapt without announcing that they are leaving something behind. What we call the fall of a civilization is often nothing more than the point at which no one remains to keep it going, not because they were defeated, but because they found other ways to live that felt less demanding. The end, seen this way, is neither tragic nor dramatic, but quietly human, shaped by the same practical reasoning that once allowed civilization to form in the first place. In this light, the absence of an announced ending begins to feel less like a mystery and more like an inevitability, because societies are not designed to recognize their own conclusions while they are still functioning. They are designed to solve problems, to maintain routines, and to assume that tomorrow will arrive as expected. When tomorrow eventually arrives somewhere else, civilization does not protest. It follows, leaving behind places that feel frozen in time, not because life ended there violently, but because life simply moved on. The true ending is recognized only later, when silence has had time to settle, and the work that once sustained everything is no longer being done by anyone at all. Chapter 7: The Myth of Collapse. Why history needed drama. More than the past ever did, collapse is a story told backwards. The idea of collapse exists primarily because it makes history easier to tell, not because it accurately reflects how civilizations actually change, since from the perspective of people looking backward, it feels comforting to imagine a clear moment when things fell apart, a dramatic turning point where cause and effect align neatly, and the end becomes obvious even though life rarely unfolds with such narrative discipline. Collapse is a word that belongs to observers, not participants, because those living inside a civilization experience change as continuity under pressure rather than as an approaching finale, and continuity has a way of disguising transformation by preserving familiar shapes while altering their function. From a distance, centuries later, it is tempting to draw a sharp line between before and after to label one side success and the other failure. Yet this line rarely existed in reality because the people on either side of it did not experience their lives as belonging to different eras. They woke up, worked, raised children, solved problems, and adapted to circumstances that shifted gradually enough to feel like extensions of the present rather than departures from it. Collapse, when applied retroactively, becomes a storytelling shortcut, compressing long processes into a single word that suggests suddenness, finality, and inevitability, even though none of these qualities were present at the time. This compression satisfies the modern desire for explanation, offering a sense of closure that the past itself never provided, yet it also obscures the quieter truth that most civilizations do not collapse so much as they thin, stretch, and reconfigure until the old form no longer describes what people are actually doing. What makes the myth of collapse so persistent is that it aligns with our instinct to seek drama in history, because drama creates meaning, heroes, and lessons, while gradual change feels unsatisfying and difficult to moralize. A collapsing civilization can be blamed, warned against, or mourned, whereas a civilization that slowly disperses resists judgment, offering no clear villain and no obvious mistake. The language of collapse allows us to imagine that something went wrong at a specific point, that a better decision could have prevented the outcome, and that the end was therefore avoidable, even when evidence suggests that the transformation was the cumulative result of many reasonable choices made under changing conditions. This framing reassures us by implying control, suggesting that history operates according to discernible rules that reward wisdom and punish error, rather than acknowledging that societies often drift into new forms without consciously choosing to abandon the old ones. Collapse narratives also satisfy a deeper emotional need, providing a sense of tragedy that elevates the past into something worthy of attention, while quiet transitions risk being dismissed as unremarkable. In this way, collapse becomes less a description of events and more a reflection of our own expectations about how important things should end. Yet when we look closely at the evidence left behind by many ancient societies, the drama implied by collapse is conspicuously absent, replaced instead by signs of orderly departure, gradual adaptation, and selective continuity. Cities empty without being destroyed, infrastructure remains intact without being maintained, and cultural practices persist in altered forms long after their original centers have been abandoned. These patterns suggest not a sudden breakdown, but a redistribution of people and practices across space and time, a process that feels more like migration than catastrophe. From the inside, such movements likely felt pragmatic rather than tragic, guided by the desire to reduce effort, increase security, or simply adapt to new circumstances rather than by fear or desperation. The myth of collapse, when imposed on these realities, distorts them by emphasizing endings over continuities, obscuring the fact that what appears to have vanished often survived in quieter, less centralized forms. Civilization did not fall apart. It moved, softened, and changed shape, leaving behind structures that later observers mistake for the remnants of failure rather than the byproducts of transition. What survives when collapse is assumed? When historians assume collapse, they tend to focus on what is no longer visible, overlooking the subtle ways in which societies persist beyond the boundaries of their most recognizable forms. Languages evolve rather than disappear. Technologies are adapted rather than abandoned, and social practices migrate alongside people, embedding themselves in new contexts that rarely receive the same attention as monumental ruins. This continuity challenges the collapse narrative by demonstrating that the end of a city or a political system does not necessarily mark the end of a culture, but rather a shift in how that culture organizes itself. From the perspective of those who lived through these changes, survival may have mattered far more than preservation, and adaptation may have felt more urgent than maintaining symbols of the past. The decision to leave a city, to abandon a particular administrative structure, or to simplify social arrangements does not imply failure. It reflects a recalibration of priorities in response to conditions that made previous arrangements less effective. Collapse narratives struggle to accommodate this nuance because they are oriented toward loss rather than transformation, measuring success by continuity of form rather than continuity of function. This bias toward visible structures also shapes how archaeology is interpreted, privileging sites that were abandoned dramatically over those that faded quietly into rural patterns or dispersed settlements. When a city empties suddenly, it leaves behind a concentrated record that invites investigation, whereas gradual dispersal produces fewer spectacular remains, making it easier to overlook or misinterpret. The absence of monumental construction in later periods is often taken as evidence of decline, even when it may reflect a deliberate shift away from centralized authority or large-scale projects that no longer served practical needs. People may have chosen smaller communities, more flexible social arrangements, or less resource-intensive lifestyles, not because they lacked capability, but because such choices aligned better with their circumstances. From this perspective, what historians label collapse may represent a form of optimization, a reduction in complexity that made life more manageable rather than less. The myth persists because it frames simplicity as loss, ignoring the possibility that complexity itself can become a burden when conditions change. Assuming collapse also affects how we interpret silence in the historical record, encouraging us to treat gaps as evidence of disappearance rather than as signs of shifting priorities. When writing slows or stops, It may not indicate that people vanished, but that record-keeping ceased to feel worthwhile or feasible, especially in contexts where survival demanded more immediate forms of attention. Oral traditions, practical knowledge, and everyday practices often leave little trace for later historians, yet they can sustain communities long after formal institutions have faded. By focusing on what is missing, collapse narratives reinforce the illusion of abrupt endings, obscuring the quieter continuities that persist beneath the surface. This emphasis on loss also shapes popular imagination, turning ancient societies into cautionary tales rather than complex human experiments that adapted, persisted, and transformed in ways that resist simple conclusions. The myth of collapse, in this sense, reveals more about modern expectations than about ancient realities, reflecting our discomfort with ambiguity and our desire for clear narratives in a world that rarely provides them. Why we prefer collapse to drift. Our preference for collapse over drift says as much about us as it does about the past, because drift lacks the moral clarity that collapse seems to offer, providing no obvious lesson, no singular mistake to avoid, and no heroic struggle to admire. Collapse implies that something definitive happened, that a line was crossed and consequences followed, whereas drift suggests a world shaped by countless small decisions, none of which felt decisive at the time. This idea is unsettling because it challenges the belief that large outcomes require large causes, and that history moves according to moments of choice rather than patterns of behavior. Drift implies that societies can change profoundly without anyone intending them to, guided by comfort, convenience, and adaptation rather than by vision or ideology. Accepting this undermines the reassuring notion that awareness alone can prevent undesirable outcomes, because it suggests that change often occurs below the level of conscious recognition. The myth of collapse also offers emotional distance, allowing us to view the past as something finished and resolved, safely contained within a narrative of rise and fall. Drift, by contrast, feels uncomfortably familiar, resembling the slow transformations we observe in our own lives and societies, where change accumulates quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. Collapse belongs to history. Drift belongs to experience. By framing ancient transformations as collapses, we protect ourselves from recognizing similar patterns in the present, preserving the illusion that our own systems will announce their endings clearly, giving us time to respond. Drift denies this comfort, suggesting that endings are rarely recognized until long after they have occurred, and that the absence of drama is not a guarantee of stability. In the end, the myth of collapse persists because it gives shape to uncertainty, transforming complex, extended processes into stories with beginnings and endings that feel manageable. Yet when we set aside this myth, a different picture emerges, one in which civilizations behave less like fragile towers and more like living organisms, adjusting their shape to fit changing conditions, shedding structures that no longer serve them, and redistributing their energy rather than losing it entirely. These societies did not disappear. They changed their mode of existence, often becoming less visible to those who measure significance by scale and permanence. The ruins we study are not tombstones marking failure, but footprints left behind by people who moved on, carrying their lives into new contexts that history has yet to fully understand. Recognizing this does not diminish the past. It humanizes it, replacing dramatic endings with quieter, more honest accounts of how people respond to change. The myth of collapse fades when we listen closely to what the evidence actually suggests, and what it suggests is not a story of sudden ruin, but of gradual drift, reasonable choices, and the enduring human tendency to continue living, even when the shape of civilization no longer resembles what came before. Chapter 8: People Leave, Not Ideas. Civilization changes address, not existence. Empty cities, full lives elsewhere. When a city is abandoned, it creates the illusion that something essential has vanished, because we tend to equate buildings with people, streets with stories, and walls with memory. Yet the absence of human presence in a place does not mean the absence of human life itself, only that life has chosen to continue somewhere else. From a distance, empty cities feel like endings, as if civilization itself paused and then stopped, leaving behind silence that invites dramatic interpretation. But from the perspective of those who left, nothing so absolute occurred. They did not disappear. They relocated, carrying with them the knowledge required to build, repair, organize, and adapt, because civilization is not a fixed location, but a collection of habits practiced by people who are capable of moving. The unsettling calm of an abandoned settlement often misleads later observers into imagining catastrophe, yet the lack of destruction suggests something quieter and more deliberate, a transition rather than a collapse. Houses remain standing not because life ended suddenly, but because no one needed to destroy them in order to leave. Tools are missing not because they were lost, but because they were taken, selected carefully according to usefulness rather than symbolism. The city feels empty because it is no longer inhabited, not because its people vanished from history. In many cases, those people were simply living elsewhere, continuing their lives with the same rhythms, just under different roofs, in different landscapes, where effort felt more manageable and daily life demanded less negotiation. Civilization did not die here, it moved its center of gravity. This distinction matters because it shifts how we understand the past, forcing us to separate the fate of places from the fate of people. Archaeology often privileges fixed structures because they endure, yet people are not fixed, and their mobility is one of the most consistent features of human history. When a city empties, it does not mean that its culture has been erased, only that it has detached itself from a particular geography. Language continues to be spoken, skills continue to be taught, and social norms continue to shape behavior, even as the physical environment changes. The illusion of disappearance arises because we encounter absence at the original site, mistaking spatial emptiness for cultural loss. Yet ideas do not remain behind with walls. They travel with the people who practice them. Civilization, understood this way, is remarkably portable, capable of surviving the loss of monumental centers precisely because it is embedded in daily routines rather than architecture. The ruins we see are not the remains of people who failed to survive, but of places that ceased to be useful. Life went on, just not there. What people carry when they leave. When people leave a city, they do not leave empty-handed, even if the archaeological record suggests otherwise, because the most important elements of civilization are not the ones that remain behind, but the ones that move quietly and invisibly with them. Skills are carried in hands and memory, not in stone, and these skills, how to build shelter, manage water, grow food, resolve conflict, and cooperate with others, form the true infrastructure of civilization. Knowledge does not announce itself as it travels, which is why it often escapes notice, yet it shapes new environments quickly, allowing displaced communities to recreate functional systems wherever they settle. Habits travel as well, embedded so deeply in daily life that they feel natural rather than cultural, influencing how people organize space, divide labor, and respond to challenges. Even values, often assumed to be tied to specific places, prove remarkably adaptable, adjusting to new circumstances while retaining recognizable forms. What disappears when a city is abandoned is not civilization, but convenience, the accumulated investment that made life easier in that location. What persists is the capacity to rebuild, a capacity refined through generations of experience. Memory also travels, though not always in forms that leave material traces. Stories, practical lessons, and shared understanding are passed through conversation rather than inscription, shaping behavior without requiring preservation in archives or monuments. This oral continuity is difficult for historians to track, yet it plays a central role in sustaining civilization across transitions. People remember what worked and what did not, which places were easier to live in, and which demanded constant effort, and these memories inform future decisions, guiding migration and settlement patterns in ways that appear rational rather than desperate. Over time, these accumulated experiences form a body of knowledge that allows societies to adapt fluidly, choosing when to stay and when to move without framing either choice as failure. Civilization in this sense resembles a set of learned responses rather than a static achievement, capable of being expressed wherever conditions permit. The fact that these elements leave little physical evidence does not diminish their importance. It highlights a bias in how we measure continuity, privileging what remains over what moves. This mobility complicates the collapse narrative because it reveals that what we interpret as disappearance may instead represent redistribution. Populations thin in one place and thicken in another, spreading skills and practices across a wider area while reducing reliance on centralized systems. From the perspective of those who relocate, this process feels adaptive rather than tragic, offering relief from strain rather than loss of identity. The choice to move often reflects confidence rather than desperation, rooted in the belief that life can continue elsewhere with less effort. Civilization does not fracture under these conditions. It disperses, becoming less visible but more resilient, embedded in smaller communities rather than concentrated in monumental centers. The loss of scale is often mistaken for loss of capability, yet smaller, more flexible arrangements may offer advantages in uncertain environments. What disappears is the spectacle of civilization, not its substance. Civilization as a moving pattern. If civilization is understood as a pattern of behavior rather than a physical location, its apparent disappearance becomes easier to explain because patterns can shift without breaking, adapting to new contexts while retaining core features. Cities represent one expression of this pattern, optimized for particular conditions, yet when those conditions change, the pattern does not vanish. It reorganizes. People reconfigure their lives around different spatial arrangements, different scales of interaction, and different resource strategies, carrying with them the logic of cooperation that made urban life possible in the first place. This logic does not depend on stone walls or central plazas. It depends on shared expectations and learned responses that remain intact even as the physical setting changes. Civilization, seen this way, behaves less like a structure and more like a rhythm, capable of slowing, speeding up, or changing tempo without stopping entirely. This perspective helps explain why so many abandoned cities show signs of careful departure rather than panic, because those leaving did not experience their movement as an end, but as a continuation under new conditions. They did not need to preserve the city as a symbol, because their identity was not confined to it. Instead, they preserved what mattered: the ability to live together, solve problems, and maintain a degree of order. The city, once essential, became optional, and optional things are often left behind without ceremony. Archaeological remains reflect this pragmatism, showing selective removal rather than destruction and suggesting confidence in the future rather than despair about the past. Civilization, at this stage, becomes less about maintaining a specific form and more about preserving function, a shift that may appear as decline from a monumental perspective but represents continuity from a human one. Understanding civilization as a moving pattern also challenges assumptions about progress because it reveals that complexity is not always additive. Societies may choose to reduce scale, simplify organization, or abandon large projects not because they lack ability, but because such complexity no longer serves their needs. This reduction is often misinterpreted as regression, yet it may reflect a rational response to changing circumstances. Prioritizing flexibility over grandeur, civilization does not always move toward greater concentration or visibility. It sometimes survives by becoming quieter, less centralized, and harder to detect. The ruins that capture our imagination are often the remains of forms that outlived their usefulness, while the living continuation of civilization unfolded elsewhere, leaving fewer traces for us to find. What we study then is not the end of civilization, but the end of a particular configuration, mistaken for total disappearance because we are inclined to equate visibility with existence. What truly disappears? When cities are abandoned and structures decay, it is tempting to say that civilization has vanished. Yet what truly disappears is not people, knowledge, or social capacity, but location, the specific arrangement of space that once made life efficient. Geography changes, resources shift, and what was once advantageous becomes burdensome, prompting people to detach their lives from places that no longer justify the effort required to maintain them. This detachment feels unsettling to those who encounter it later, because it contradicts the expectation that civilization must anchor itself permanently to the ground. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that mobility is one of humanity's most reliable survival strategies. Places fall out of use not because they are cursed or destroyed, but because they are no longer optimal. Civilization follows opportunity, not architecture. The quiet humor in this process lies in how stubbornly we cling to the idea that civilization should remain where it began, as if movement implies failure rather than intelligence. We marvel at ruins and ask what went wrong, when the evidence often suggests that nothing went wrong enough to trap people there. They left because they could, because they recognized that staying was no longer the best option, and because their skills allowed them to rebuild elsewhere. The ruins are not tombstones marking extinction. They are footprints marking departure. Civilization's persistence is visible not in abandoned streets, but in the continuity of human behavior across space and time, a continuity that rarely leaves dramatic evidence. What disappears is the illusion that civilization belongs to places rather than people. In the end, the most misleading aspect of abandoned cities is their silence, which tempts us to imagine absence where there is only relocation. People did not fade from history, they moved through it, carrying their lives forward while leaving behind structures that no longer served them. Civilization, understood this way, is resilient precisely because it does not depend on permanence. It survives through movement, adaptation, and the willingness to let go of forms that no longer fit. The city may empty, the streets may quiet, and the buildings may stand unused, but the ideas that made them possible continue to shape new environments elsewhere. What we call disappearance is often nothing more than a change of address, a reminder that civilization is not a place that can be lost, but a practice that continues wherever people decide to live. Chapter 9. Silence is the hardest evidence. When history leaves nothing to argue with, nothing written, nothing explained, silence is difficult for history because it refuses to cooperate, offering no dates to underline, no names to repeat, and no sentences to quote, leaving behind a space where explanation should be but is not. And it is precisely this absence that unsettles modern minds trained to expect records, narratives, and causes neatly arranged into sequences that imply intention. When archaeologists encounter societies that left no chronicles, no final inscriptions, and no formal explanations for their disappearance, the instinct is to assume loss, destruction, or ignorance as if something essential must have been taken away, rather than considering that nothing was taken because nothing was considered necessary to leave behind. From the inside of those societies, the idea of documenting an ending would have felt strange, even unnecessary, because endings did not present themselves as events demanding recognition, only as a gradual thinning of participation, attention, and effort. Writing, when it exists, serves continuity rather than closure. And when continuity weakens, the impulse to record weakens with it, not as an act of forgetting, but as a reprioritization of energy. Silence, in this context, is not evidence of chaos, but evidence of fatigue, the quiet result of people choosing to focus on living, rather than explaining themselves to a future they did not imagine. The lack of written explanation frustrates modern inquiry because it denies us the comfort of interpretation, forcing us to confront a past that did not feel obligated to justify its choices. This absence of explanation feels especially uncomfortable because it resists storytelling, and storytelling is how we make the past manageable. We prefer histories that speak clearly, offering lessons, warnings, or at least coherent sequences of cause and effect. Yet silence refuses all of this, presenting instead a flat surface where interpretation slides without traction. When there is no record of why people left, when there is no final decree or lament, modern observers fill the gap with speculation, often mistaking quiet for mystery and mystery for catastrophe. The assumption that something must have gone terribly wrong reveals more about our expectations than about the past itself, because we equate significance with noise and believe that important things must announce themselves. In reality, many societies did not see their transitions as remarkable enough to document, and the absence of commentary suggests not confusion but acceptance. Silence, then, becomes a form of evidence, not because it explains anything directly, but because it reveals how unremarkable the ending felt to those who lived through it. What we experience as a mystery may have been experienced as a series of ordinary days that gradually lost their collective weight. Why silence makes us uncomfortable. Modern discomfort with silence arises from our dependence on explanation, because explanation reassures us that events are understandable, that outcomes can be traced to decisions, and that awareness might allow us to avoid similar fates. Yet silence denies all three comforts at once. When a civilization leaves no explanation for its disappearance, we are forced to accept that people may have moved on without drama, conflict, or a sense of finality, a possibility that undermines the belief that history is shaped primarily by decisive moments. Silence suggests that change can occur without intention, without recognition, and without record, challenging the idea that awareness is a prerequisite for transformation. This is unsettling because it implies that societies can drift into new forms without ever realizing they are doing so, guided by habit rather than foresight. In this light, silence becomes threatening, not because it hides information, but because it exposes the limits of control, revealing how much of human history unfolds below the threshold of conscious acknowledgement. We want the past to speak so that we can listen, learn, and feel prepared, yet silence offers no guidance, only the suggestion that preparation may not be as effective as we hope. This discomfort is intensified by the way silence resists moral framing, offering no villains, no heroes, and no clear mistakes to condemn or admire. A silent ending provides no cautionary tale, no lesson neatly packaged for future generations, leaving us without the satisfaction of judgment. We cannot say that these societies failed because they were corrupt, foolish, or unprepared, because silence does not accuse. It simply exists, indifferent to interpretation, forcing us to confront the possibility that endings can be ordinary, unremarkable, and emotionally neutral. This neutrality feels inadequate to modern sensibilities, which expect historical significance to be accompanied by intensity, yet intensity is not required for transformation. Silence reveals a different kind of significance, one rooted in gradual disengagement rather than dramatic rupture. The absence of explanation becomes an explanation in itself, suggesting that nothing felt urgent enough to record, that no one perceived a moment worthy of commemoration. This challenges the assumption that awareness and documentation are inevitable responses to change, revealing instead how easily societies can transition without naming what is happening. Silence also complicates the historian's task by offering no resistance, no contradictory voices to compare, and no narrative to dismantle, leaving interpretation suspended between evidence and imagination. Without written accounts, historians must rely on material remains, patterns of settlement, and indirect indicators, reconstructing stories that feel tentative rather than authoritative. This uncertainty frustrates modern expectations of expertise, which value confident conclusions over ambiguity, yet ambiguity may be the most honest response to a past that chose not to speak. Silence does not invite argument, it absorbs it, reminding us that the past is not obligated to satisfy our curiosity. In this sense, silence is not a failure of evidence, but a boundary, marking the point beyond which interpretation becomes speculation. The discomfort we feel reflects our desire for closure, a desire that silence refuses to fulfill. Quiet endings without climax. Silence often marks endings that lack climax, conclusions that unfold without confrontation, resistance, or final gestures, and these quiet endings may represent the most common form of conclusion in human history precisely because they require the least coordination and the least emotional investment. When people stop maintaining systems, stop gathering, stop recording, and stop returning to certain places, the result is not collapse but absence, a gradual withdrawal that leaves behind spaces once animated by routine. These endings do not feel like endings at the time because they do not disrupt daily life abruptly. They simply allow daily life to relocate elsewhere. The lack of climax makes them difficult to remember because memory favors intensity. Yet the absence of intensity does not diminish their impact. Entire ways of life can fade without resistance, not because people are unaware, but because awareness does not demand action when conditions remain tolerable. Silence accompanies these transitions because nothing compels speech. And speech, like writing, requires motivation beyond survival. This pattern challenges the assumption that endings must be marked by conflict or declaration, suggesting instead that many societies conclude through a process of quiet disengagement, where participation thins until continuation ceases naturally. People do not gather to decide that a civilization is over. They simply stop doing the things that once sustained it, redirecting their energy toward arrangements that feel more workable. The absence of ceremony reflects the absence of perceived loss, because from the inside, life continues, just under different conditions. Silence, in this context, is not grief, but indifference, a sign that the old form no longer demands attention. This indifference feels unsettling to modern observers because it denies the emotional weight we expect from historical change, yet it may be more representative of how humans actually respond to gradual transformation. When change arrives slowly, it rarely inspires dramatic response. It inspires adjustment, and adjustment does not announce itself. Quiet endings also resist commemoration because there is nothing to commemorate when no one feels that something has ended. Memorials require consensus about significance, and significance is difficult to assign to processes that feel incremental rather than decisive. As a result, silence persists not only in the historical record, but in collective memory, leaving later generations with the impression that something was lost without explanation. This absence of memory invites myth-making, encouraging dramatic interpretations that compensate for the lack of narrative. Yet these myths often obscure the simpler truth that many endings are not experienced as losses at all. Silence, then, becomes a form of honesty, reflecting the emotional reality of those who lived through the transition rather than the expectations of those who study it later. The lack of climax is not a deficiency. It is a clue, indicating that the ending felt too ordinary to require acknowledgement. Silence as the most common ending. When viewed across long stretches of time, silence emerges not as an anomaly but as a pattern, suggesting that the most common way civilizations conclude is not through destruction, conquest, or sudden collapse, but through quiet abandonment and reconfiguration that leave little behind to interpret. This realization challenges the dramatic framing that dominates popular history, replacing it with a more subdued understanding of change as something that often happens without notice. Silence, in this sense, is not a void but a signal, indicating that nothing dramatic occurred, that life adjusted rather than broke, and that people moved on without feeling the need to explain themselves. The discomfort this creates for modern observers reflects a mismatch between our expectations and historical reality. Because we expect importance to be loud and endings to be marked, yet history frequently operates without regard for narrative satisfaction. Silence becomes the hardest evidence precisely because it offers nothing to contest, no claim to refute, and no voice to interrogate, leaving only the fact of absence and the suggestion that absence was enough. This perspective reframes silence from a problem to be solved into a phenomenon to be understood, encouraging us to consider how much of human history unfolded without fanfare, documentation, or conscious recognition. Societies did not always feel compelled to explain themselves to the future, and the absence of explanation does not imply confusion or failure, only a different set of priorities. Survival, adaptation, and comfort mattered more than legacy, and when conditions changed, people responded accordingly, without announcing that they were doing so. Silence marks the point where explanation ceased to feel useful, not because nothing happened, but because what happened felt ordinary. The challenge for modern interpretation is to accept this ordinariness without inflating it into drama, to recognize that quiet endings are not incomplete stories, but complete experiences that simply resist our desire for spectacle. In the end, silence stands as the most honest evidence of all, not because it tells us what happened, but because it reveals how little needed to be said. Civilizations did not always leave behind warnings, lessons, or confessions, and perhaps they did not need to. They lived, adapted, and moved on, leaving behind traces that speak only through absence. The silence we encounter in the archaeological and historical record is not an obstacle to understanding, but an invitation to reconsider our assumptions about change, significance, and endings. It suggests that the most common conclusion in history is not a fall, but a fade, not a moment of destruction, but a gradual quieting that feels unremarkable to those who experience it and profound only to those who arrive later. Silence, then, is not the absence of history, but one of its most consistent forms. Chapter 10: The Uncomfortable Modern Mirror. Why decline? Rarely feels like decline while it is happening. We are certain we would notice. Every age believes it would recognize decline if it ever arrived, because awareness feels like protection and knowledge gives the comforting illusion that we are standing outside the process rather than moving through it. Able to observe warning signs with clarity and respond before anything irreversible occurs. We imagine ourselves watching history unfold, with the benefit of hindsight already installed, confident that we would spot the cracks early, name them accurately, and intervene decisively, because decline in our imagination announces itself through unmistakable signals: empty streets, failing systems, open unrest, visible decay. This belief is deeply reassuring because it suggests that collapse is something obvious, something that happens to inattentive people, not to those who are informed, prepared, and reflective. Yet this confidence rests on a misunderstanding of how decline actually feels from the inside, because the people who lived through earlier transitions believed the same thing. They also assumed they would notice when things were going wrong, and they also trusted their ability to respond in time, because from within a functioning society, decline does not feel like a dramatic event, but like a series of manageable adjustments. Life continues to function, services still operate, and daily routines still provide enough stability to justify confidence, allowing people to interpret change as temporary fluctuation rather than structural transformation. The belief that awareness guarantees control becomes part of the problem because it encourages endurance rather than reconsideration, convincing societies that as long as they can explain what is happening, they can manage it. This conviction that we would recognize decline is reinforced by how history is taught, often presented as a sequence of clear failures leading to obvious consequences, creating the impression that past societies ignored warnings that seem unmistakable in retrospect. We point to empty cities, abandoned infrastructure, and vanished institutions as evidence that people must have missed something important, overlooking the fact that these outcomes were not visible until long after the process was complete. From within those societies, life did not feel like a cautionary tale in progress. It felt like normal life, under slightly more pressure than before. The signs we now identify as indicators of decline were experienced as inconveniences, challenges, or temporary setbacks, none of which demanded radical response while basic functions remained intact. This gap between retrospective clarity and lived experience fuels our confidence that we would do better, because we assume that knowing the ending equips us to avoid it. Yet knowledge of outcomes does not translate into recognition of process, especially when that process unfolds gradually and rewards adaptation rather than resistance. The uncomfortable truth is that awareness does not prevent decline. It often coexists with it, providing commentary rather than correction. The past thought the same thing. Ancient societies did not drift blindly into change, unaware of their circumstances, because they too observed their world closely, discussed challenges, and adjusted their behavior in response to perceived risks. They noticed when resources became harder to access, when labor demands increased, and when systems required more maintenance to deliver the same results. Yet these observations did not trigger declarations of crisis because nothing had failed outright. Instead, they inspired problem-solving, innovation, and adaptation, reinforcing the belief that difficulties could be managed within existing frameworks. From their perspective, these responses demonstrated competence rather than vulnerability, confirming that society was functioning as intended by responding to stress. The idea that they were approaching the end of a particular way of life would have felt implausible, because life continued to reward effort, even if those rewards were diminishing. Just as we reassure ourselves that challenges are signs of complexity rather than collapse, they interpreted strain as evidence of resilience, not fragility. This shared mindset reveals a continuity across time, a human tendency to trust systems that still operate, even when they require increasing effort to sustain. What distinguishes hindsight from experience is not intelligence but distance, because only distance allows us to compress long processes into single narratives and label them as decline. The people who lived through these transitions did not lack insight. They lacked the ability to see their own present as history. Their concerns were immediate, practical, and grounded in daily survival, rather than abstract trajectories, making it unlikely that they would interpret gradual change as a definitive endpoint. When conditions worsened, they responded with adjustments that made sense locally, not with sweeping reforms that assumed a shared understanding of the future. This localized reasoning is often mistaken for short-sightedness, yet it reflects the reality that large-scale transformation rarely feels coherent while it is happening. The past did not fail to notice decline. It noticed change and responded accordingly, without framing that response as participation in an ending. The assumption that earlier societies were unaware of their situation flatters modern sensibilities, but it ignores the continuity of human perception, which has always prioritized immediate experience over distant consequence. This continuity should be unsettling because it undermines the belief that modern awareness confers immunity. We often tell ourselves that access to data, historical knowledge, and analytical tools sets us apart from the past. Yet these tools do not alter the fundamental way humans experience gradual change. Information accumulates faster, but perception still operates within the present moment, interpreting stress as something to manage rather than something to escape. Just as ancient societies normalized increasing effort, we normalize complexity, workload, and instability, framing them as the cost of progress rather than indicators of unsustainability. The mirror becomes uncomfortable when we recognize that our confidence in recognition mirrors the confidence of those who came before us, suggesting that belief alone is insufficient protection. Decline does not require ignorance. It requires only that life continues to function well enough to discourage radical change. Decline does not feel like panic. One of the most persistent misconceptions about the end of civilizations is that decline must be accompanied by fear, unrest, or visible panic, as if people abandon systems only when they feel threatened or desperate. Yet historical evidence suggests the opposite, that civilizations are more likely to fade when conditions remain tolerable rather than catastrophic. Panic motivates immediate action, while tolerability encourages endurance, and endurance, when extended indefinitely, can drain the willingness to maintain complex systems without ever provoking revolt. When daily life remains workable, even if exhausting, people adjust their expectations downward rather than demanding transformation, accepting inconvenience as the price of stability. This acceptance creates a powerful inertia because systems continue to operate not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar. Decline, in this sense, is not an emotional crisis, but an energy crisis, marked by diminishing enthusiasm rather than escalating fear. The absence of panic is not evidence of stability. It is evidence the conditions have not crossed a threshold that demands immediate response. This explains why civilizations often persist longest in states that feel just manageable, where effort and reward remain balanced closely enough to justify continuation, but not comfortably enough to inspire investment in the future. People continue to participate, maintain infrastructure, and uphold institutions, not because they believe deeply in their permanence, but because participation still solves problems. Over time, however, this participation becomes transactional rather than aspirational, driven by necessity rather than commitment. When systems demand constant attention without offering improvement, they cease to feel worth maintaining, not because they have failed, but because they no longer provide a sense of progress. This shift is subtle, rarely discussed openly, and often invisible in official records, yet it shapes behavior in profound ways. People begin to withdraw effort incrementally, choosing efficiency over engagement, minimal compliance over active contribution, and private solutions over collective ones. Decline under these conditions is experienced not as collapse, but as disengagement, a quiet reduction in the energy invested in shared structures. The lack of panic also explains why decline is so difficult to reverse, because without a sense of crisis, there is little motivation to undertake disruptive change. Radical reform requires emotional urgency, yet tolerable conditions suppress urgency by providing enough stability to justify patience. Societies wait for clearer signals, for undeniable evidence that something has gone wrong. But by the time such evidence appears, participation has often thinned to the point where coordinated response is no longer possible. The end arrives, not because people failed to care, but because they cared just enough to keep things going, postponing decisive action until the collective capacity to act had diminished. This pattern repeats across history, revealing that panic is not the driver of decline. Comfort is. Civilizations do not disappear when people are afraid, but when they are tired, distracted, and increasingly convinced that their effort might be better spent elsewhere. When it no longer feels worth maintaining. The most decisive moment in the life of a civilization is rarely the moment of greatest danger, but the moment when participation begins to feel optional, when people realize that maintaining shared systems requires more effort than the benefits they provide. This realization does not announce itself dramatically. It emerges quietly through comparison as individuals observe alternative ways of living that appear less demanding or more rewarding. The question shifts from, can we survive this, to, is this worth continuing? And this shift marks a profound change in orientation because survival motivates endurance, while worth motivates choice. When people begin to frame their relationship to civilization in terms of choice rather than necessity, the foundations of continuity weaken, not through rebellion, but through reallocation of effort. Time, attention, and energy are finite, and when maintaining shared systems no longer feels justified, these resources are redirected toward private solutions, smaller communities, or entirely new arrangements. Civilization does not collapse in this moment. It thins, losing participants gradually as engagement becomes selective rather than universal. This thinning is often invisible while it is happening because systems can function with fewer participants for a long time, masking the extent of disengagement. Infrastructure remains in place, institutions persist in name, and routines continue to operate, creating the impression of stability, even as the pool of people willing to sustain them shrinks. Eventually, however, the reduced participation reaches a point where maintenance becomes unsustainable, not because the system is flawed, but because too few people consider it worth their effort. At this stage, decline accelerates not through catastrophe, but through neglect. As tasks go undone, repairs are postponed, and coordination weakens. The end, when it comes, feels anticlimactic, marked by absence rather than destruction. People do not flee, they stop returning. Civilization is not overthrown, it is outgrown, left behind as life continues in forms that feel more aligned with available energy and desire. The uncomfortable mirror this holds up to the present lies in the recognition that we, too, measure worth constantly, deciding which systems deserve our attention and which can be ignored. We tell ourselves that we would notice decline, that we would act decisively if things truly mattered. Yet history suggests that matters rarely present themselves with such clarity. Instead, they erode slowly, reframing participation as optional long before disappearance becomes visible. The past did not fail to recognize decline. It experienced it as a series of reasonable decisions made under changing conditions, each one defensible, each one insufficient to halt the larger process. This realization does not offer comfort or alarm. It offers perspective, reminding us that civilizations do not end when people panic, but when they quietly decide that maintaining them no longer feels worthwhile. The mirror is uncomfortable because it reflects not catastrophe, but ordinariness. And ordinariness is far harder to resist than fear. They didn't fail, they finished. Hello and welcome back, wherever you are listening from, whatever hour has quietly found you, and however gently the day has loosened its grip, because this final moment is not meant to wake you, persuade you, or press any conclusion too firmly into place, but simply to sit beside you for a while, like a low lamp left on, in an empty room, steady and uninsistent, as we let this long story come to rest. They did not fail. That is the first thing worth saying slowly, without argument or emphasis, because failure implies error, miscalculation, or moral weakness. And none of those ideas fit particularly well when we look closely at how most ancient civilizations actually ended. These societies did not collapse because they misunderstood the world, nor did they disappear because they were careless, foolish, or blind to their circumstances. In many cases, they understood their environment, their limitations, and their options with remarkable clarity, and they responded not with drama, but with adjustment. They lived within the constraints they faced, adapted as long as adaptation felt reasonable, and when continuation required more energy than it returned, they chose to stop investing in a particular arrangement of life. That is not failure. That is completion. A task carried as far as it could be carried under the conditions available, then set down without ceremony, when it no longer fit the hands holding it. To say that these civilizations finished is not to romanticize them or excuse hardship, but to acknowledge a simpler truth about human systems. They exist to serve life, not the other way around. When a city no longer made daily life easier, when maintaining it required constant effort without offering stability or meaning in return, people did not cling to it out of loyalty to history or fear of judgment. They left. Not all at once, not in panic, but gradually, thoughtfully, often with relief. They took with them what mattered: skills, habits, relationships, ways of solving problems, and left behind what did not: walls, streets, and structures that had once been useful but had become burdensome. Civilization did not vanish in that moment. It changed shape. It released one form and continued in another, quieter one, less visible to later eyes, but no less real to the people living it. The silence that followed was not a sign of confusion or loss of memory. It was the sound of nothing needing to be explained. From within those societies, there was no sense that a great ending had occurred, no moment that demanded reflection or documentation. Life simply moved elsewhere. Writing slowed because writing is an activity of settled systems, and settled systems were no longer the priority. Records faded because survival, comfort, and adaptability mattered more than legacy. To us, this feels unsettling because we want the past to speak clearly, to leave notes, warnings, or confessions behind. But the past was not speaking to us. It was speaking to itself, in the language of daily decisions, and when those decisions no longer required a place to be maintained, the place was allowed to fall quiet. This quiet is often mistaken for tragedy because modern storytelling trains us to expect endings to hurt, to rupture, to announce themselves with loss that can be measured and mourned. Yet many of these endings were not experienced as tragedies at all. They were experienced as transitions. Families found better land. Communities reorganized at smaller scales. Life became simpler in some ways, harder in others, but it continued. The emotional weight we project onto abandoned cities belongs more to us than to the people who left them. We see emptiness and imagine grief, because emptiness feels unresolved, while they saw opportunity, relief, or simply the next practical step. History records the silence, but it does not record the sense of lightness that may have accompanied departure, the quiet understanding that staying was no longer necessary. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable idea of all, that history at its most common does not move through grand arcs of triumph and disaster, but through completion. Tasks finished, systems retired, places outgrown. Civilization in this view is not a fragile achievement always on the verge of failure, but a flexible practice that expands, contracts, and relocates as conditions change. It builds when building makes sense. It maintains when maintenance is worth the effort. And it lets go when letting go becomes the most reasonable option available. There is no shame in this process, no moral lesson hidden inside it, only a pattern repeated so often that it becomes invisible unless we slow down enough to notice it. We are uncomfortable with this pattern because it offers no villains and no heroes, no single mistake to avoid, and no single virtue to celebrate. It does not reassure us that awareness alone can prevent endings, nor does it promise that effort will always be rewarded with permanence. Instead, it suggests something quieter and more difficult to accept, that impermanence is not a flaw in civilization, but one of its core features. Societies are built to respond to specific conditions, and when those conditions change, the most successful response may be to change as well, even if that change leaves behind structures that once felt central to life. What remains centuries later are the shells of those structures, impressive and haunting, while the living continuation of civilization has moved on, leaving fewer traces for us to admire. If this feels anticlimactic, that may be because we've been trained to expect history to entertain us, to resolve itself cleanly, to deliver meaning in dramatic gestures. But history, as lived, is rarely interested in performance. It is interested in functioning. When something functions, it continues. When it stops functioning, it is replaced, not mourned. The idea that civilizations must either succeed forever or fail spectacularly leaves little room for this kind of quiet conclusion. Yet quiet conclusions are everywhere once we learn how to see them. They are written not in stone, but in absence, in the slow thinning of activity, in the gentle decision not to return. So perhaps these civilizations did not disappear at all. Perhaps they simply stopped asking the same place to carry the weight of their lives. Perhaps they finished what they came to do there, learned what could be learned, built what could be built, and then allowed themselves to move on without apology. There is a humility in this, a refusal to demand permanence from a world that does not offer it freely. And there is also a kind of wisdom, one that recognizes when effort has exceeded benefit and chooses rest, relocation, or reinvention instead of stubborn continuation. As this series comes to a close, there is no lesson to extract, no warning to underline, and no parallel to draw too sharply. The past does not ask us to fear endings, nor does it ask us to cling to forms that no longer serve us. It simply shows us again and again that most things end not with a sound, but with a decision not to continue. And that decision made quietly and without announcement is not necessarily a tragedy. It is often just history doing what it has always done, adjusting, redistributing, and moving forward without needing to explain itself. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening slowly, and for allowing these quiet stories to unfold at their own pace. Wherever you are, may the rest of your night be gentle, and may the silence that follows feel less empty and more complete, like a room after the work is done. The lights are lowered, and nothing more needs to happen for now.